This is Alki Leopoulou on behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School Board of Alumni Association here in New England, and I want to welcome you to this behavioral science talk with Sitkin. We are co-hosting the event with the Harvard Club of Merrimack Valley and their colleagues from Harvard Club of North Shore. I'm gonna pass it on to Stuart to say hello to his friends.
Welcome all from north of Boston, the clubs at Merrimack Valley and Concord, Massachusetts, and the North Shore. Very glad you can join us today for another in our behavioral science series that we've been coordinating with the Kennedy School Alumni Association. I do want to apologize for anybody who may have misread our first announcement on this. It's Professor Sitkin's, not Coach K, talking today. I'll tell you, for this presentation, I'd much rather have Professor Sitkin doing the talking. But if I had one game and I had to win it, I'd go for Coach K. So with that, let me pass it over to the real speaker today, Alki, who's going to just introduce the professor, and then the professor will take over.
Perfect. Thanks, Stuart. All right, Sim, we're very happy to have you here. Sim is a pretty big name in the field, so I'm very excited he's here with us today. He's an expert in innovation, change management, a lot of other things, but these are the ones that stand out for me. Sim, you were also part of the Harvard School of Education as well, if I'm correct. So I graduated from there as well. So a professor at Duke University, and he has an extensive work with courage and what people can do with organizations, and a lot of books and that. So I encourage you to look into the different options that he has. Sim, we're ready to learn from you. Any questions that you have, feel free to add in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll give you some opportunity in the end as well to talk about the questions as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. One thing I would ask is, Alki, if you notice that there are any items in the chat or hands that are raised or anything, and I'm missing them, please flag it for me.
Yeah, perfect.
And let me just say, I'm happy to take questions or comments as we go along as well. You don't have to feel like you have to hold them till the end. What I'd like to do today is draw on several areas of some recent research that I've been doing over, I'd say the past 5-10 years, and that are, I think, particularly relevant to the challenges that we face today. And in particular, here, let me move us through. What I'm planning on talking about today is, first of all, the notion that we face really big challenges in our lives, in our societies. And the question that has troubled me for some time is, have we, certainly in the United States, but also more broadly, lost our ability to recognize and step up to really major challenges? And what can we do? What can we draw on in terms of research to help us know what to do to facilitate the ability, both for us as individuals, for those we might be leading, and for society as a whole, to step up to grand challenges. So I'm gonna talk about this in terms of 3 kinds of segments, and I'll basically just introduce the ideas, provide some, I hope will be stimulating kind of research findings that we've identified, and hope that will lead to some dialogue and discussion. The first is, there has been talk over a number of years of what's referred to as stretch goals. And I'll define those, I'll explain how they work, and ask the question, is it always appropriate to really pursue these stretch goals as a way of getting at these grand challenges that we face? The second is, what is the role of leaders? Can leaders actually help people raise their aspiration level to make it more likely people will step up to these kinds of challenges? And then finally, if we rethink the way we typically have approached courage and think about it in terms of everyday courage versus heroic courage, might that be another way of helping to foster a willingness to step up to these big challenges. This is a quotation that illustrates the kind of concern I've had. This is from Dan Richards, who is the chairman of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, where he said, California has built the world's greatest water conveyance system, one of the great highway systems, a great university system. When did we lose our confidence in our ability to do this stuff? If you look at examples of the kind of problem I'm talking about, do we look in the public and private sector at a willingness to take on long-term, high-risk, complex policy initiatives, or do we only go for the low-hanging fruit? Are corporations hoarding cash but not deploying it for major new initiatives? You can look at the federal government, you can look at financial reform, you can look at how conversations often talk about how we should rely on the creative engine of small businesses without having large corporations take their role in stepping up and really overcoming risk aversion and quarterly return pressures and tackle bigger kinds of questions. Here's some additional examples from the United Nations, a report of just about a year or two ago. And I'm not going to go through this whole list, but it ranges from poverty and food security to infrastructures and safety and inequality and so forth. These are really major issues that require us to step up. Some organizations have done it. So for example, both Google and Amazon are illustrations that are often cited. Some elite universities like Harvard or Duke have stepped up to do some things. Some government organizations have done that historically. I mean, we did build the Panama Canal, the Cross-Continental Railroad, we landed on the moon. Wealthy foundations like the Gates Foundation or MacArthur are starting to do this. But the problem is it is more isolated examples than it is a systematic approach. And what I'm trying to encourage is that we think more systematically about how to do it. And we don't only rely on those who have the assets, let's say, of the Gates Foundation to tackle bigger kinds of challenges. So as I said, I'm going to look at this in terms of three kinds of things that we can do. The first is using stretch goals and when it's appropriate, but not when it's inappropriate. The second is the role of leaders in fostering raised aspirations. And then the third is everyday courage. Let's start with stretch goals. So there are a number of examples that are cited when people talk about stretch goals. Southwest Airlines instituting a 10-minute turnaround for airplanes when nobody else in the industry thought that that was even remotely possible. There Toyota, Port Authority of Singapore, Otakon, the US EPA, and a small company, Blue Whale Moving Company. These are just a few examples, but there are many of them. The problem is, even though they have been widely cited, they're not really understood well. So it's not clear, if I want to do this, what do I do? How do I make sure I do it more successfully? And when should I stay away from it? Now, what we need to do is to raise aspiration levels if we're going to go for what Google refers to as moonshots, which I refer to as stretch goals. And I especially want to highlight the notion these are not always a good thing to pursue, but there are times when we should, and there are individuals or organizations that should be pursuing these stretch goals. And you'll see part of what we found in our research is the wrong ones are trying for this, and the ones who should be trying are not. So we have a number of articles and pieces. We have a Harvard Business Review article. We have some other ones. The one highlighted at the top here, When Should You Shoot for the Moon, was a piece I did that Google asked me to do for them because they were talking about moonshots so frequently, and they said, they acknowledged they didn't really know what a moonshot was, so they'd like some help in understanding it. And we have some more recent papers that are coming out on when should you say yes to one of these stretch goals, when shouldn't you? How can you do it under conditions of high uncertainty? Let me define what I mean by stretch goals. there's a long definition here, but basically what it comes down to is it's tackling a goal that is seemingly impossible under current conditions. So for another individual or another organization, it may not be a stretch goal. It might be easy for them, but for you, it is seemingly impossible because you don't know, it's difficult, but you also don't know how to get there. So the dimensions are, yes, it's difficult, but it's also novel enough that you really don't know of a path to get to success. But people take it on, organizations take it on because it can facilitate learning and it can facilitate performance when it's done appropriately. Some of our research suggests the mechanisms by which this can be done. The factors that predict whether you will tackle a stretch goal and whether you will succeed are on the left here. And those are the predictors of, do you have slack resources? Really a great amount of knowledge, talented people, funding, time. How has your recent performance been? Have you been doing well? Now, if you've been doing well and you have slack resources, what that tends to facilitate is these mechanisms of being able to learn from the experience of pursuing a stretch goal, because you're usually not going to succeed the first time, updating based on new information, and thinking of this as an opportunity to do something meaningful and important rather than focusing on it as a threat. Those tend to lead to stretch goal success. Now, what fosters stretch goal success? There are two issues that I just mentioned. One is, have we been winning? Winners tend to be more optimistic and confident. Do we have resources? You can explore more options. You can try various things out. You can leverage your existing capabilities, and you can overcome early failures. Now, what are the things that get in the way? This is going to be a little surprising, I think. It's the same two factors. Recent success. If we've been winning lately, the reaction is often, what do I need to go for a stretch goal? I can just keep on doing what I'm doing. I'm doing just fine. Second is, if we have a lot of resources, you would think that could be deployed to try something big. But in fact, it means that often what you see is it gets in the way because people and organizations get complacent. They feel they're safe. They don't have to try to reach for that very difficult thing. Now, what we identified in our research out of these observations is what we call the paradox of stretch goals. And the paradox is essentially those who should pursue stretch goals don't, and those who shouldn't pursue them do. You should pursue them when you have lots of resources and successful recent performance. Typically, who is driven to go for these really ambitious stretch goals? Those who are trying to overcome a recent failure. Those are, the phrase, a Hail Mary pass or going for broke is what typically describes the organizations and individuals who go for stretch goals. Those who are in the best position to pursue them tend to become risk averse and complacent and not go for the real big stretch goal, but go for something that's safer. Now, we've analyzed this in terms of this kind of, I'm not going to go through the details on this, but if you look in the upper right quadrant where you've got high recent performance and high resource availability, what tends to happen is the risks get inflated and the gains get underweighted. If you go to the lower left, the risks get underweighted. You figure, why not go for it? I've got nothing else to lose. And the possible upside gets inflated. The issue is how to figure out, and what we found is both resource availability and recent performance drive whether individuals and organizations pursue stretch goals. Now, this is a little, I don't know why, but it's a little fuzzy, but this is a figure that's from our Harvard Business Review article. And basically what it highlights is if you've been successful or if you've been unsuccessful, what should you use as a decision tree for whether I should go for a stretch goal? And there are alternate options for you if you don't meet the criteria. One is to go for a strategy which has been called small wins. By pursuing smaller ambitious goals, you can build momentum, you can build confidence, you can accumulate resources that may position you for going for that bigger goal. If you are in other circumstances, you may need to just do experimentation to try to figure out what might work. That's a strategy which in some of my earlier work I called small losses, where what you're doing is really experimenting, knowing that early on things are going to fail. They're not going to work most of the time, but eventually I'll learn enough so then I can pursue maybe small wins, or if I'm in a more advantageous position, a bigger stretch goal. The implications of this are that when you're doing well, you should think about, is there something big I can go for? In sports, you would probably call that the killer instinct, that if you're really beating a team badly, don't let them back in the game. Really go for that big win, because otherwise they could claw their way back and overcome your lead. In terms of business and government, when we're in a position of strength, rather than sit back and just reap the benefits of that strong position, that's the time we should ask, what are the big things we can tackle now? Because we're resilient, we're resource rich, or at least resource available. Let's try to look at that next horizon and see if we can overcome it. Now, when your past performance is lower or your resources are lower, you can, as I said, not pursue stretch goals, but pursue small wins or small losses. Or what you can do is partner with others who have sufficient resources, and together you may be able to overcome and take on these big challenges. In some sense, as I put in the box at the bottom, this seems very intuitive and obvious. But when we looked both at the historical research literature and in our own research, what we found is what's obvious is not what's being done. What's being done is those who are in a position to tackle the big things become complacent and risk averse. Those who should be more incremental in their approach tend to go for the big things, and it doesn't work. Now, let's turn to the second facet, but I can actually pause for a second here and see if there are any comments or questions before we move on.
Perfect. I was gonna interrupt you actually, so that's as if we planned it. All right, so I have one question, logistics. Will you be sharing the slides? Is there a chance you'll be sharing the slides with people?
Oh, sure, I can do that. That's no problem.
All right, perfect. And another question that came up was if there's if you're aware of the metrics Google uses to define moonshots.
No, I mean I know what they did some time ago when I was interacting with them on this. I don't know what they currently do, but part of the reason they asked for some assistance in thinking it through is it was not being used consistently throughout the organization, and it was a little more impressionistic. People would make judgments about, do we have a known path for getting there? What do we think the probability is? And so forth. I've been working, as another example, I'm actually working with two organizations right now on this. One is a very large international healthcare organization, and the other is the US Army. And in both of those cases, the same was true. When they were tackling and trying to operationalize stretch goals, it was much more the judgment of the executive team as to what would be a real stretch for a particular unit or individual. And I do think that if you're moving, there is a long history of research on what's referred to as challenging goals. And we understand those well, and we know they work very well as motivators and for improving performance. Those are easier to calibrate. The issue with stretch goals that makes it difficult for organizations is they are seemingly impossible under current circumstances. So when you're extrapolating and trying to set targets, you may set something that you say, this would be really challenging, but I can think of 2 routes or 3 routes by which we can get there. Let's go beyond that. And, a famous example was Jack Welch talked about at General Electric how they put in their annual report, they were gonna go for this ridiculously high number of inventory turns to increase their efficiency and profitability. And it was 4 times what they'd ever done historically. They had no idea whether that was even possible. If they had done 2 times what they'd ever done historically, it would still have been a stretch goal. So I think sometimes they're defined by what you say. Oh, like Southwest Airlines said, if we're going to be profitable, we have to do it in 10 minutes. Nobody had ever done it in less than, I think at that time, it was 40 minutes or 30 minutes. They didn't know if it was possible. So a lot of times the stretch goal determination is not as algorithmic as we would like for that reason. Were there other questions, or should I keep going?
I'm gonna ask 2 more questions. I guess feel free to raise your hand as well if you'd like, and we'll give you permission to talk. Another question is, do you think these principles apply to personal decisions of individuals or solely related to organizations?
The answer is yes, it applies to both. So our original paper on this was written both at the individual and the organizational level. And the journal asked us to pick one. So the paper that got published was at the organizational level. But in fact, it was considered a finalist for an award for research at the individual level because it applies just as much.
Yeah, remember that was the first question I asked you as well. So it's pretty funny. This is how it worked. Another question, and then I guess we can move on, is does the fully autonomous ground transportation system, public vehicles, private vehicles, commercial, count as
wait, hold on. You got to slow down a little bit on the question.
The question is if the fully autonomous ground transportation system, like public vehicles, private, commercial, count as moonshots. And then if so, any reflections on competitive moonshots?
Yeah, so what I would say is the key indicator to look for whether it's a moonshot, whether it's a stretch goal, is can you lay out paths that are actually based on something, that are not just sort of delusional fantasies, but are based on something, a pathway by which you could get there that has probabilities that are greater than 0. And for some of these, I think so one way that some organizations have approached stretch goals successfully is they wade into it and say 6 months later or a year later, they say, oh, now we understand it better. We can parse the problem. And let's say half of the problem we defined originally, we actually know pathways to get to those pieces of it. So maybe we know about a power system, or maybe we know about some other piece of that kind of transportation solution, but there's still these other 2 or 3 pieces that we have no idea how to get to. So even though you're still pursuing a stretch goal, you've reduced the parameters of that stretch goal and you can focus your attention much more. That's the common pattern that we've seen, that a big complex stretch goal gets narrowed down as you begin to chip away at it or realize you actually do have knowledge, experience, and solutions that could apply to parts of it. That doesn't mean it'll crack the whole problem.
Perfect.
Okay, why don't I move on, and then we can come back if there are additional questions on this. Okay, so what are the roles of leaders in doing this? Because if you think about it, if we're trying to encourage people to pursue these aspirational goals, could a leader play a role in fostering this? And so we did some research on this. Leadership is one of the areas that I do research on. And I'm going to just report on 2 of the studies that we did. One was an experimental lab study. The other was a 360-degree survey of working executives, where what we were looking at is what are the behaviors the leader engages in? To what extent does that lead the followers to raise their aspirations, set higher goals? And to what extent does setting those higher goals lead to performance improvement on the? So this is at the individual level. This is not looking at organizations. Although I think the same logic should apply, but we haven't studied it there. So let me tell you how we laid this out. I'll try to do this kind of quickly. The first was, the basic idea was if you want me to raise my aspiration level, I've got to believe you know what you're talking about. So you've got to convey to me as a leader that you're competent in what you're trying to get me to do. So if you decide we should double our output and we can do that in 24 months, are you really new to my organization and ignorant about our constraints? Or are you really, do I view you as a real expert who knows when you say we can do that? You know, Stuart mentioned before something about Mike Krzyzewski, and I can tell you, one of the things that I've talked to Mike about is when he first started coaching, it was a lot tougher for him because he couldn't say to this all-star player, I've been to Final Fours, I've won national championships. If I tell you you can do this, you can believe it. Now, when he says that, the competence is given. They assume it. When he first started out, that was not necessarily the case. And if we're tackling a challenge that is really novel for everybody, you've got to demonstrate that you have some competence in that area if you're going to get me to raise my aspirations. The second is, given that really extreme goals are likely to lead to failure, at least in the beginning, will I be treated fairly? Will the leader understand that and make sure that I am not punished for something that's not my fault? And so the basic theory and historically was, if you're viewed as more competent, if you're viewed as fair, people will raise their goals and that will lead to better performance. What we added to that in some of our research was that there's a degree to which you need to be inspirational if you want people to set higher targets. That competence and fairness might help, but it's not enough. So we wanted to test this idea. What makes leaders inspiring and what were we looking at? Do they articulate a vision? Do they set high standards? Do they convey an optimism, a reason to believe that we can ultimately succeed at this, even if we failed at the first few attempts? And enthusiasm that this is really worthwhile striving for. So what did we find? In both of our studies, what we found was that the past research, which showed competence and fairness led directly to goal raising, was not supported. Instead, I'm going to be viewed as more inspirational if you believe I'm competent and if you believe I'm treating you fairly. My inspirational behaviors will in turn lead you to raise your aspirations, and that will in turn lead to better performance. Two things I want to highlight here. One is, we found, interestingly enough, we found this to hold whether those you were trying to influence started out with low goals, moderate goals, or high goals. When leaders were able to exhibit inspirational leadership behaviors as we defined them, all three of those levels shifted up. So it's not just the low performer you can motivate or the high performer you can motivate to go higher. Everybody shifts up when you exhibit inspirational leadership behavior. The other thing is, if you think about why these might be important, is if you're not competent, I may view you as delusional rather than inspirational. If you're not going to treat me fairly, I may view you as manipulating me rather than really trying to inspire me. And so the pathway that we had hypothesized seems to have really held up. And to me, it's very encouraging because it suggests leaders really can make a difference. And there are specific behaviors that leaders can exhibit that would encourage people to be willing to shoot much, much higher. Before I go to the third piece of encouraging courage, let me stop. I see there are some questions and some chat. So let's see. Okay, so one question is this Scott? Because I was about to comment on your question. Okay, so Scott's question is, are there negative consequences of organizations going for stretch goals and not making them? And the answer is absolutely yes. And that's why, by the way, I think the leader emphasis on fairness is an important one if you want your people to try, because in the beginning, you are probably going to stumble. And some of the organizations that are able to sort of publicly announce we're going for a stretch goal are ones that have this very strong track record, like General Electric when Jack Welch did that, um, that that have that track record, so that if they stumble in the beginning, they're still highly they're viewed very positively. Um, was there a follow up to that, or did I respond?
And I don't know if Scott wants to ask anything else. There was another question here for if there is any reflection on competitive moonshots. Multiple entities are hoping to achieve this moonshot, and all are developing their solution in parallel.
Well, I mean, I think for real moonshots, they often do have to be pursued collaboratively, unless you're a very, very large, complex, well-resourced organization. I mean, I remember I was working a number of years ago with Xerox, and they had developed a new technology for a computer in a piece of glass. And they realized that this was much, I mean, Xerox is a pretty big company. They realized it was much bigger than what they could handle. And they, in collaboration with the US government, created a consortium of, I think it was 6 companies based in the US and Japan, to collaborate in developing that. So one answer to that is, if you can translate it from a competitive environment to a collaborative environment, that can be very helpful in 2 ways. One is it builds your resources, and it makes it, now it may not mean that you don't want to necessarily put together a group of 3 or 4 failing organizations and hoping magically that'll turn to success. But sometimes organizations that are not succeeding on their own can provide critical resources that, in partnership with others that have deeper pockets, can leverage that. So that said, I think we can see examples of where these stretch goals are being pursued competitively, and there's nothing that says that you can't do that. Sometimes small organizations succeed at that, but I think the problem is we overweight the luck that was involved when a small organization was able to do that, because it often really does require deeper pockets than those organizations are able to generate, to be able to succeed at a true stretch goal. Okay, are there any other questions, or should I now, I'll move on to the next.
Yeah, you can move on, Sam. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. Let me close up. Okay, so when we think of stretch goals, it's important to think of the role of courage, because you're pursuing something that is seemingly impossible. That alone requires a certain amount of courage. As was mentioned earlier, you can be punished if you fail, even if it's not your fault. So that requires courage. So what is it about courage that would help us understand when to pursue stretch goals and when not to pursue stretch goals? And so the approach that we're taking, some research I'm doing with Moran Anisman-Raisin, who is a postdoc working with me on what we call everyday courage. So we tend to think of heroic courage, but on an everyday basis, individuals and organizations do step in and take courageous actions. And what we're thinking is a better understanding of what courage involves, and a better understanding of what everyday courage involves and how it can be deployed, may help us learn to be better at these last 2 bullets here, saying yes to stretch goals when you should, but also saying no to stretch goals when you're being seduced into pursuing them, but you're really not in the right position to pursue that stretch goal. So both of those elements, we have a recent paper that's called The Courage to Say Yes and the Courage to Say No, because both really do require courage. Okay, so let's look at what we mean by courage. What we typically think of when we use the word courage is heroism, whether it's physical courage in the military or a firefighter, or it's moral courage of a whistleblower standing up to bad behavior, or we use it to talk about psychological courage for people who are overcoming medical problems or other kinds of health issues. But there are other relevant behaviors when we think about courage that are largely neglected in the research literature, but are very important, I think, in terms of tackling a range of issues. Today, we're going to be talking about pursuing these big stretch goals. But as another example, we're talking right now about implementing the idea of everyday courage and working with veterans to help them reintegrate into civilian society and overcome some of the obstacles that they've confronted. What are the kinds of everyday courage that we're talking about? One is it takes courage sometimes to have a tough conversation with somebody, whether it's a friend or it's a subordinate or a boss. It may take courage to ask for what you think you're due in terms of a raise, for pursuing a stretch goal, which is something we've been talking about, or for being authentic, letting people know what your values are, what your lifestyle is, or whatever in the workplace may require courage. One of the ways this surfaced for me in doing executive education with people in technical firms is a lot of people who come from strong technical backgrounds have been able to hide behind the kind of mask shown in this photograph and not really reveal who they are as a person, what they care about, because it's all supposed to be just about the technical details, which is fine if you're an analyst. But if you're trying to lead people, you need to have the courage to step beyond the technical facts and actually let people know who you are. Hold on, let me take a look here. I see there's a question. Yes, absolutely. So the question is, does a leader showing vulnerability and acknowledging they're entering uncharted water play a role? Absolutely. In fact, I think leader vulnerability can take a variety of forms. If you just take these everyday courage examples, I can be pursuing a stretch goal that is not really putting my company or my career at risk, but I still could be embarrassed by it in front of my team. I could feel vulnerable by revealing a weakness of mine as a leader. I could reveal, I could have fear about having a tough conversation with somebody. And that's why many times you see that I would argue that's why school principals have vice principals or CEOs have chiefs of staff, because sometimes many of them like to deliver the good news, but they want someone else to have that difficult conversation and deliver the bad news. They want to be buffered from trying something and failing by having subordinates who can take the heat. So it does require a certain amount of courage in an everyday sense, not only for grand strategy. So we did a couple of studies on this that I'll just use to highlight this. First thing is we wanted to know how prevalent is everyday courage when you distinguish it from heroic courage, and can they really be distinguished? So we did a preliminary look at this with an online study. And what we did was we separated the population into two groups. One, we asked them for examples of where they acted courageously. We used the word courage. And our idea was that would evoke many more examples of heroic courage. Whereas if we provided a definition, which is, do you take a personal risk in the pursuit of something meaningful, that we would get more examples of everyday courage. And everybody who we studied could report one or more examples. And then what we coded those examples for was it heroic or not? And what types of risk and what types of meaning were included in their examples. So first thing, our results showed that there were many, many more, as we expected, examples of everyday courage than of heroic courage. And that occurred whether we used the definition or we used the term. But you can see when you use the word courage, you get more heroic examples. You get fewer when you use the definition, and vice versa when you use the definition and are looking for everyday courage. Now, how do we understand what courage is? I do like this quotation that it's not the absence of fear, it's the awareness that something else is important, that you're willing to take on that fear because there's something meaningful. So if you look at where we think courage lies, it's where there is high personal risk, but there's also high meaning. So if there's high risk but not much meaning, that's not courageous. That's just taking risks. That's just risky behavior. If there's high meaning but no personal risk, that may be purposeful behavior, but it's not courageous. And then if they're both low, that's just routine behavior we engage in for most of our lives. Now, if you look at the types of risk that are involved in courage, what we found is that there is a systematic pattern. There's physical risk. There can be a strategic risk, which is personal or organizational. Losing my job would be an example of a strategic risk for an individual. Relational risk, I could be rejected. I could be rejected by my group or by a friend by having that tough conversation. It could be emotional risk where I'm really afraid. I'm anxious about revealing something about myself. And there could be reputational risk. If I say I'm not so good at something as a leader, am I worried that people won't be willing to rely on me? If I admit that we tried a stretch goal and it failed, will that hurt my reputation or the reputation of my organization? Now, there are also different types of meaningfulness we discovered. The most commonly studied one is moral courage, where you're doing something to save someone's life, you're doing something in order to take a value-based stand. But there's also meaning in goal achievement, pursuing an ambitious job, trying to take on one of these stretch goals would be an example of pursuing a goal. Authenticity, I mentioned before, revealing who I am. Belonging, it may be meaningful to be really part of a group you admire or you wish to be part of. And that might motivate you to take the risk of reaching out to them. Or benevolence, you're trying to help somebody else and you're willing to take a personal risk. I'm willing to jump in the river to try to pull you out so you don't drown. That's meaningful to me. Now, how did these play out? Well, I want to highlight just a couple of things here. One is that moral and goal related meaning were the most prevalent. Moral is mostly associated with heroic leadership, but goal-oriented courage is not treated very much in the research literature on courage, and we don't think of it because a lot of it is more everyday. But goal-related courage also can be related to pursuing these big stretch goals that are really consequential. Similarly, in terms of the perceived risk, you can see that that there are aspects of perceived risk that are also related to the issues that we're talking about here. Is the risk strategic? Is the risk? Hold on one second. The basic takeaway from this slide that I want to highlight is that the issues we're talking about in pursuing grand challenges and stretch goals are the ones that we find are the most prevalent where courage plays an important part in them. Now, in terms of meaningful outcomes, what you can see here is as we predicted, moral courage, which is usually associated with heroic acts of courage, is mostly evoked when you use the word courage, whereas goal-related courage is included in both. And so so everyday courage is very frequently associated with goals. Similarly, if you look at the risks, physical courage is the most frequently associated with heroic courage, but strategic courage is actually much more common and is more often associated with the definition than it is with using the term courage. Sandy asked a question, how can just having a goal be a stretch goal? So not every goal is a stretch goal. The goal has to be seemingly impossible given current circumstances. So in other words, goals can range from really easy to challenging, where there's been a lot of research that shows that challenging goals are helpful. And the past research on stretch goals, I don't think has been very, very good. And that's because people either believed in stretch goals and just thought they were wonderful in all circumstances, or they found stretch goals to be, widely abused in organizations and not helpful at all. Whereas what we found is a lot of the things that were called stretch goals really weren't stretch goals. And stretch goals, the way when they were effective was contingent on the circumstances under which they were adopted. But doesn't the goal have to have moral, social, financial value? Well, it depends how you define those terms. You could, if you could probably put everything under the categories of moral, social, financial. But there are some things that might be strategic, where it's important for the organization or for your career, and it's not going to help you socially. It's not a moral issue. It may even hurt you financially, but strategically, it's an important thing to do. Now, you could say that that's going to be financial in the long run, but I think the reason that people pursue these kinds of goals, I think, would be related to what we identified as the meaningful kinds of outcomes. So, you could say you use social, that could be belonging. You used financial, that I would put under goals. And then the one that has to do with values, I would put under morality. But there are others that are noted here, which it could be helping others, which you could say is either social or moral, but people do categorize that quite differently. Or authenticity. Similarly, these are the ones that emerged, and we've examined, I don't know, I think it's a total of 1,400 examples, and these are the kinds of meanings that emerged from those examples, and these are the kinds of risks that emerged. We're starting to run out of time, so I want to keep going. I'm almost done. So, the issue here that I would like to highlight is that we face big challenges. Our organizations do, as individuals we do, as a society we do. And I worry, especially this started with me worrying about the US in particular, but I think it is more global than that, that having part of our core values as being tackling big problems, not backing off, being a can-do kind of orientation, is something that is in our history. And I worry that we lost our ability to do that, in part because we were so successful as a society. We had a lot of resources, we had a history of success, and that made us more complacent and risk averse, and that we needed to regain that part of our core ethic. And so then the question was, what can we do that? Can we encourage people to know when to pursue stretch goals and when not to? Can we help leaders know how to help their followers raise their aspirations? And can we help people recognize that exhibiting everyday courage is something that they've done, so people don't think of themselves as courageous, even though they may be in lots of little ways courageous? Can we then encourage people to translate that, when it's appropriate, to a bigger stage? Today especially, we face problems. Another area that I do research in has to do with trust and distrust. And you see the need for rebuilding trust in our societal institutions, in our organizations, and in our leaders. The data show serious erosion of that. And so I'm hoping that some of the things I've talked about today will provide some insight into ways we can take these big fuzzy problems and try to break them down and make some progress against them. So let's see, I'm done there. I see there are 2 questions. Let me see what I got here. So the first one is, perceived risk varies dramatically from individual to individual. Oh, does this cause problems in researching it? or applying it? Um, the answer is, well, I don't think it's a problem, but what it means is you've got to be attentive to recognizing exactly what you're saying, that different individuals and different organizations have a different risk profile. They're more or less sensitive to it. They have more or less of a propensity to tackle risks. So one is, do you see them? The second is, how do you react? Does it make you nervous? Does it make you excited? And then the third is, are you able to tackle them? And you do have to take that into account because it does vary. But the issue here is, if you do not see a risk, then courage really isn't invoked. If you do not see a risk, but there really is a risk, you may be tackling a stretch goal, but not recognizing it's a stretch goal. You think it's something you can easily do because you've misperceived the situation. Let's see, this question, Wayne has a question. When I think of stretch goals with a strong leadership component, I think of the original literal moonshot. Yes, when JFK announced the plan to land on the moon. I haven't analyzed that, but I do use that as an example. And remember when I talked about the competence of the leader and the fairness of the leader? There's really an important component of what JFK did in that, which people often omit. He not only said, and it was a stretch goal, that we're gonna land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Now, NASA had a lot of confidence, but it was a stretch goal. We didn't know if we could get there, but we had the best odds. The part that is also relevant here, so that highlights competence. The part that is also relevant here is fairness. He also included the phrase, not only we will land a man on the moon, but we will bring them home safely. You want your leader who is sending you off to pursue a stretch goal to want you to get back from that stretch goal safely. To achieve it and get the glory, that's great. Or if it fails, to make sure that you're going to be taken care of for having taken on a risk on behalf of the society or the organization. Are there any other questions or comments?
I guess one last question, if we don't have anything else, is if there are other examples you can share that you think are very helpful for us to understand more.
Well, yeah, one thing that I think is an important one. So the healthcare organization that we've been studying, what drew me to them, and actually we mentioned them in our Harvard Business Review article, the thing that they did that drew me to them was they created a unit in their organization to run experiments. And there are lots of companies and government agencies that are doing this now, that are setting up behavioral science units, and they're running a lot of experiments. I mean, we've talked about Google. Google has two of them, one that's running experiments on their employees, and another one that's running experiments on their customers. But what almost all of the units that I've seen are doing is they're running experiments at the individual level. They're seeing, if I use a different color, or if I frame it this way, or if I provide this incentive, does it change how people respond? What drew me to this healthcare organization was they were running organizational experiments. They were taking different clinics and different operating units, and they were setting stretch goals for them. And not everything was stretch goals, but they were setting up these units to try different things out at the organizational level. And that's much, much riskier. And for many of them, they were stretch goals. So they could see what worked, what didn't work. They could see where they could reach higher and provide better patient care, for example, beyond what was normally thought of, or provide equally good care at greatly reduced cost. So I do think that that one of the things that I see as very promising is the idea of organizations running these organizational experiments. And there is a federal initiative that started under the Obama administration, that's continued under the current administration, that is working with a number of federal agencies to do both kinds, working on experiments at the individual level, but also working on some experiments at the organizational level. And I would encourage both.
You have two questions, Sim.
Okay.
We're out of time. I don't know if you have.
Let me see if I can do them really quickly.
Yeah.
Have you found an impact of level of seniority on a willingness to take risk? Are senior people more or less willing to take risk? The answer, I don't have a good answer to that because we haven't studied it explicitly. And I think you could argue it both ways. They should be more willing to take risks because of their success. And one of the scarce resources they have more of is power. But you could also argue that they're going to be less willing to take risks because of that. I really don't know. What I have observed just a little bit, though, is a gender difference in that women seem to not be diminishing the willingness to take risk as they rise, whereas men are more willing to, are more hesitant to take risk as they rise in the ranks. It would be nice if that weren't the case, but again, I don't have really strong evidence of that yet, so that's more, I would say, more speculative. But it's a great question. It would be interesting to see. Okay, let's see. I'm assuming you're familiar with Bella et al.'s The Good Society. Yes, particularly regarding institutional trust and effectiveness. And I'm wondering on your thoughts on how your work relates to that research. Well, actually, there are several things. One is there is not nearly as much research on institutional trust as there is on individual or organizational level trust. But it's very important, and that work is I think foundational in terms of the work that's being done. And in fact, right now I've started an initiative to look at the question I ended the presentation with, which is, we know that trust in our leaders and our institutions has eroded, and that we need to rebuild that, to try to pull the best minds together, both from the research side and the practice side, to begin to tackle those issues of how do we rebuild trust, whether it's in government agencies, media, science, et cetera. Many of our institutions and our leaders have been questioned, and it would be, I think, invaluable if we can tackle that. I think that.
Yeah, this is it.
Okay. Well, thank you all for your attention. I hope it was helpful.
I think it was very interesting and helpful. This is the feedback that people are sending me as well privately. You guys have in the chat the next talk as well with Ashley with HBS talking about being smart during COVID. You can sign up there. Thank you, Sim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And okay. we'll share the slides and everything else. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.